A bead of sweat carved a slow line from her temple, sliding along the hard angle of her jaw before dropping onto the polished steel housing of the high-frequency transceiver. It struck without sound, forming a flawless, trembling sphere that warped the reflection of the harsh utility light above. Her hand remained perfectly still. Her breathing stayed measured and even, a controlled internal cadence that dismissed the fire in her lungs and the deep strain settled into her shoulders. She was locked in a stress hold, arms fully extended, fingertips suspended a millimeter above the fragile solder points. She had just restored. The diagnostic display to her left showed a single, unwavering, green, line-clean, stable, flawless. Only when the wall-mounted chronometer crept past the 10-minute threshold did she permit her muscles to release. A long, soundless breath escaped her as she lowered her arms with deliberate care. The physical endurance was not separate from the mental discipline. It was part of it. Stillness had to be forged into the body so that precision could exist at the microscopic level. The body learned obedience to the mind, never the reverse. Beyond the insulated confines of the communications workshop, the wind screamed across the compound, a relentless, grieving howl that served as the unofficial anthem of this isolated Northern Territory's assignment. It was a sound capable of eroding weaker spirits, grinding away resolve through sheer persistence. To her, it was nothing more than a constant variable environmental data to be accounted for, no different from temperature, drift, or signal noise. She lifted a lint-free cloth and removed the solitary drop of sweat from the transceiver's casing. Her movements efficient, exact, free of excess. Her task here was complete. The long-range array would now operate at 103% of its factory-rated capacity. That extra margin was her hallmark, born from an obsessive refinement of harmonic balance and power distribution that no technical manual could ever convey. Another sound intruded upon the wind's dominion, the heavy, grinding growl of an approaching transport engine. She felt its presence as a vibration traveling through the concrete beneath her boots. Incoming personnel. She shifted her attention to the exterior surveillance feed. A six-wheeled armored troop carrier, crusted with ice and frozen mud, rolled to a halt near the barracks. The rear ramp dropped, and a dozen figures emerged, bundled in heavy winter gear, their movements stiff and awkward after hours in transit. They were noisy. Even through layered insulation, their voices carried. A surge of loud, careless energy slammed into the base's quiet, methodical rhythm. She watched them briefly, her face betraying nothing. They were all young. Their posture radiated confidence, the unscarred, unchallenged kind that had yet to be tempered by failure. They clapped each other on the shoulders, laughter cracking sharply through the frozen air. They were not like the analysts and technicians who formed the backbone of the installation. These were combat troops, a rapid reaction unit brought in to reinforce security. They viewed the world as a list of objectives. She viewed it as an interdependent network of variables. Her focus settled on two figures in particular, taller than the others. Their movements steeped in an alpha bravado that was as foreseeable as it was exhausting. They would dominate every room. They would test boundaries first. She turned away from the screen. Her evaluation was complete. They were simply a new factor to be accounted for. She powered down the diagnostic console, coiled the cables with deliberate precision, and logged her work in the station's digital maintenance archive. Each action reflected a philosophy that placed process above impulse, discipline above ego. Outside, the storm intensified another factor added to the equation. The forward operating base stood like a manufactured island of steel and reinforced concrete, amid an endless white expanse of Arctic tundra. It was a place defined by straight lines and rigid angles. Humanity's attempt to impose order on a landscape that rejected it outright. For Captain Eva Rostova, this environment offered clarity. The cold-honed thought. The unyielding wind stripped existence down to essentials. Here, distractions did not survive only the mission and the complex systems that sustained it. Her position was uncommon. She served as a technical intelligence officer, specializing in signal interception and network warfare. Yet she was also trained in direct action and survival within hostile environments. She occupied a rare intersectional living bridge between the sanitized realm of data and the violent reality of field operations. That dual nature made her difficult to place. Analysts found her too physical, unsettled by the quiet intensity she brought into their abstract domain. Security personnel viewed her as an outsider, a thinker unsuited for their instinct-driven world. She belonged fully to neither. The arrival of the infantry detachment only sharpened that isolation. They moved through the base with the air of conquerors. Their cliquish behavior and silent defiance of the existing order were unmistakable. They ate as a unit, trained as a unit, and claimed the small recreation room as though ownership were implied. There Lieutenant Chung, polished and fresh from the academy, served, more as a symbol than a source of authority. Real influence resided with two specialists, Kalin and Rurik. They were the gravitational center of the group. Kalin was massive, loud, and demonstrative, every motion designed to project dominance. Rurik was slimmer, restrained, his eyes sharp with a calculating awareness that posed a subtler threat. Eva recognized the type immediately: soldiers who confused aggression with strength and volume with leadership. Her sole genuine equal on the base was Sergeant Major Thorne, a man whose service predated her birth. Thorne belonged to an older generation of soldier, one that valued competence above all else. As the base command sergeant major, his understated approval carried more weight than formal commendations. He often appeared in her workshop, coffee mug in hand, observing her work in companionable silence. He never asked what she was doing, only how it was progressing. He understood that her steady hands over a circuit board constituted a weapon as surely as the rifle she qualified with. His respect was unspoken but solid, a barrier against the quiet tide of institutional doubt. One evening, he found her alone in the mess hall, studying satellite-derived topographical maps of the surrounding mountain ranges. "There's a handful," he said, voice low. He didn't need to clarify. Eva didn't lift her gaze. "They're young, untested," Thorne amended. "They think this is just another rotation. They don't respect the cold. They don't respect the silence." He took a slow drink. "And they don't know what to make of you." "I'm not here for them to make anything of me, Sergeant Major," she replied, tracing a deep ravine with her finger. "I'm here to do my job." Thorne nodded. "I know. Just stay alert. Pride comes before the fall, and those boys are full of it. When that spills over, it gets dangerous." It was a warning, quiet, paternal, born from decades of watching confident young soldiers meet avoidable ends. She finally looked up, gray eyes steady. "I am always aware, Sergeant Major." He held her gaze, then allowed a faint, satisfied smile. He saw the resolve beneath the calm. The exchange ended. The variables had been logged. The recreation room was cramped and overheated, heavy with the odor of stale coffee, damp wool, and pine-scented cleanser. It was the sole place on base where rank softened and protocol bent, if only marginally. Eva occupied a small table in the corner, distant from the noisy cluster of specialists who had seized the center. A thick paperback on advanced radio wave propagation lay open before her. She wasn't reading it. It served as a barrier, a social disguise that allowed observation without invitation. Kalin and Rurik dominated the space, voices rising above the rest as they recounted a training exercise, exaggerating details, laughter loud and performative. The younger soldiers listened intently, admiration evident. Eva cataloged the noise as background interference, filtering it automatically as her attention narrowed. keywords, and subtle shifts in tone. A reflex carved into her awareness by years immersed in signals intelligence. And the instructor, this old fossil, says, "We can't make the ridge by sundown," Kalen was boasting, his hands slicing through the air for emphasis. I told him, "Just watch us. We cleared it in half the time." Left the support crew choking on our dust. His gaze swept the room, hungry for approval, and then settled on Eva, alone in her corner. A crooked grin tugged at his mouth. He dropped his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial to his inner circle, yet loud enough to travel. Of course, some people wouldn't get that. They're used to fighting wars from a comfy chair. Staring at a screen, a few of the younger specialists snorted with laughter. Rurik leaned forward, layering his own poison onto the moment. "Hey, don't knock the analysts. If it wasn't for them, who'd keep the coffee hot? That's critical support, right?" The ridicule was deliberate. A calculated test to see if she would respond. Eva did nothing. She didn't lift her eyes from the open pages in front of her. Her shoulders stayed loose, her breathing slow and even. To them, her stillness looked like submission, like uncertainty. They couldn't grasp that it was restraint control refined to an art. She was stone in a moving current. And their words slid past without leaving a mark. Her silence emboldened. "Kalen." He shoved himself back from the table and sauntered toward her, using his size as a weapon, letting his shadow spill across her book. "That looks heavy," he drawled, condescension thick in his voice. "Need help hauling that back to your office, ma'am?" The title was twisted into a barb. Eva lifted her gaze slowly. Her eyes were cool, detached, devoid of offense or fear. She studied him the way she might examine malfunctioning equipment, identifying stress points, design flaws. "I'm fine, specialist," she replied evenly. The absence of emotion unsettled him far more than anger ever could have. He had been waiting for indignation, for flustered protest, for anything that would let him push harder and reclaim dominance. Her composure stripped him of that leverage. Irritated, he reached down, hand moving to snap her book shut. It was childish, invasive, a clear breach of protocol and personal space. The room seemed to tighten around the moment. Conversations died. Every eye turned. This was the confrontation they'd been anticipating. His fingers were centimeters from the page. When she moved, there was no strike, no obvious block. Just motion, smooth, efficient, economical. As Callan's hand descended, Ava's left hand rose, meeting it with an open palm. Not forceful, not aggressive. Her fingers brushed the back of his wrist precisely over the radial nerve, while her thumb found the pressure point beneath. It was contact, not impact, before his brain could process what had happened. She rotated her wrist slightly, redirecting his own momentum. The arm that had carried his intent collapsed into uselessness, transformed from a weapon into a lever she controlled. His body pitched forward, center of gravity gone. His boot scraped clumsily as he struggled to remain upright, shock flashing across his face. He was bent over her table, his arm locked not in pain, but in perfect, inescapable immobility. He couldn't pull free. He couldn't push through. The restraint felt less like strength and more like an unbreakable law of physics. The entire exchange lasted less than a second. It was quiet, exact, and devastating. Eva hadn't even risen from her chair. She held his wrist firmly, without tension, and looked up at him. Her expression unchanged. "You're off balance, specialist," she said softly, her voice cutting through the dead air. It wasn't a threat. It was instruction, an objective statement. A lesson in biomechanics delivered without malice. The other soldiers stood frozen, mouths slightly open. They had expected shouting, maybe a clumsy shove. Instead, they'd witnessed something precise and absolute control so complete it rewrote their understanding of confrontation. For the first time, Rurik's confidence faltered. His familiar smirk erased in the far corner. Sergeant Major Thorne, who had observed the entire encounter in silence, lifted his coffee and took a slow sip. Something like approval flickered across his weathered face. Eva held Kalen in place for 2 more seconds. Long enough for the reality of his helplessness to settle fully. His breathing was ragged, his face flushed with adrenaline and humiliation. Then, just as smoothly as she'd begun, she released him. She opened her hand and let his arm go. Kalen staggered back, clutching his wrist as if it were shattered. There was no mark, no bruise, no sign of force, but his stare was hollow. His swagger gone, replaced by confused, simmering anger. He had been neutralized completely, and with effortless ease. Eva assessed him one last time, a brief, dismissive glance. Then she closed her book, rose from her seat, and inclined her head slightly toward Sergeant Major Thorne, a quiet exchange of professional respect. Without another word, she walked out, posture straight. Steps measured and soundless. The silence she left behind pressed down harder than the noise that had preceded her. Kalen remained standing in the center of the room, every eye on him. His authority hadn't been challenged. It had been dismantled. The briefing room was cold, its air sterile with the constant hum of climate systems and server banks. A holographic projection of the Tartarus mountain range filled the center table, peaks and ravines shifting in layers of blue and white. The newly arrived detachment stood, assembled, rigid, and alert. Kalen and Rurik lingered at the rear, faces tight with resentment. The sting of the previous night still raw. At the head of the table stood Colonel Marcus Vance, a career officer defined by efficiency and an impatience for theatrics. Sergeant Major Thorne stood beside him, a quiet pillar of authority. "All right, listen up," Vance said, voice sharp. "At 0400 hours, we lost contact with an automated signals intelligence relay station, Sierra 9. He indicated a pulsing red marker on the map. It's positioned deep in the Tartarus Range. That station is critical. It monitors cross-border traffic we can't access from this location. We don't know if this is equipment failure, weather-related damage, or something intentional." He let the implications settle. Though officially demilitarized, everyone in the room understood that hostile patrols favored those mountain corridors. This is a priority, one tasking. A technical team will deploy to the relay, identify the fault, and restore functionality. Given the weather and the possibility of hostile contact, this detachment will provide security and support. The specialists straightened, focus snapping into place. This was their reason for being here. Kalen's shoulders squared, a trace of his former arrogance creeping back as the mission gave him familiar ground. He exchanged a brief look with Rurik. This was their opportunity redemption on their own terms. A chance to reclaim status and prove their worth where it mattered most. Your mission commander for this operation. Colonel Vance continued, his gaze moving deliberately across the assembled faces, is Captain Eva Rostova. The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. A quiet shock rippled through the detachment to collective pause. A synchronized intake of breath, glances exchanged in disbelief. Kalen's features locked into rigid disbelief, anger pressing hard beneath the surface. Rurik's eyes narrowed, sharp and calculating. They were being placed under the authority of the very woman they had mocked. The analyst they had dismissed as a screen-bound liability. Eva stepped forward from the edge of the room where she had stood unnoticed. She wore the same Arctic-rated field gear as the rest of them. But on her, it appeared less like issued equipment and more like a natural extension of herself. She moved to the holographic table with measured confidence, her expression unreadable. "The route is hazardous," she began, her voice slicing cleanly through the lingering silence. There was no trace of satisfaction in her tone, no hint of retribution, only precision. "The primary access trail is likely buried. We will navigate by terrain association. Ingress will be on foot. Estimated travel time is 10 hours, assuming weather stability. She lifted her gaze, addressing the group as a whole. Callan and Rurik received no special attention. The environment is our primary adversary. Cold exposure will incapacitate you faster than hostile fire. Thermal discipline, hydration, and energy management are non-negotiable. She gestured calmly. Specialist Callan, you have point. Specialist Rurik, rear security. Lieutenant Miller, she said, acknowledging their nominal leader, you will manage spacing and communications. Any questions? None came. The silence was heavy with unspoken resistance. Callan's jaw worked as though he might object, but a single sharp look from Sergeant Major Thorne cut the thought short. This wasn't a discussion. It was command. The humiliation had become official. Their combat expertise, the core of their identity, was now formally subordinate to the woman they had openly disrespected. For Eva, the decision was purely logical. She was the senior authority on both the equipment at Sierra 9 and Arctic operations. Her leadership was operational necessity, nothing more. Personal dynamics were irrelevant data. For the specialists, 'twas everything. 6 hours into the march, the world collapsed into white. Snow driven by gale-force winds tore across the terrain horizontally, visibility reduced to less than 5 meters. The temperature had plunged, the air so brutally cold it cut the lungs like broken glass. They were deep within the unforgiving grip of the Tartarus Range. Captain Rastova's original plan, meticulously calculated, had been invalidated by the storm's sudden violence. The blizzard had descended without warning, a towering wall of white that erased the landscape entirely. The team became a chain of specters moving through a blank void. The crunch of snowshoes and the screaming wind were the only sounds that existed. Eva moved at the center of the formation, a steady core amid chaos. Her head was in constant motion, eyes searching for faint outlines of rock and ice, cross-referencing them against the three-dimensional map she carried in memory. Every sense was engaged, tasting the air, feeling subtle shifts in wind direction, listening for the ominous groan of unstable snowpack that could precede an avalanche. An hour earlier, their GPS units had failed, signals swallowed by the storm's ion-charged atmosphere. Navigation now relied solely on compass, map, and the judgment of their point man. That point man was Callan, driven by a need to reassert himself. He pushed the pace, trusting instinct and refusing to acknowledge how dire the situation had become. He was certain he knew a shortcut, a ravine that would shelter them from the wind. Eva had warned against it, citing the map's indication of rockfall activity. But Lieutenant Miller, swayed by Callan's confidence, deferred. Now they were lost. Eva recognized it with absolute certainty. The slope angle was wrong. The rock formations didn't align. Callan had led them into a narrowing box canuna, dead-end masquerading as opportunity. Pride had transformed a hazard into a promise. Fatigue and fear crept through the team. The cold pressed in like physical weight, draining strength and resolve. Rurik, covering the rear, kept glancing into the swirling snow, weapon tight against his chest, seeing threats where there were none. Eva called a halt. Her voice, transmitted through the helmet, comes cut cleanly through the wind. Hold. The line stopped. Heads bowed against the storm. Callan turned, frost clinging thick to the fur of his hood, his expression sharp with defensive anger. "We're almost through it, Captain," he shouted. "The ravine's just ahead." Eva stepped forward, sure-footed, despite the treacherous ground, stopping close enough that shouting wasn't necessary. She raised her compass. The needle spun wildly, useless in the magnetic interference created by iron-rich canyon walls. "Your compass is compromised." "Specialist," she said evenly. "So is your instinct." She pointed, not to the map, but to the terrain beneath their feet. The snow here is fresh powder and stable. The wind is scouring exposed rock on the port side while depositing drift on the starboard. That indicates a wind channel, not shelter. You've led us into a terrain trap. Kalen stared, denial warring with the evidence. I know this area. I studied the maps. You studied a two-dimensional abstraction, Eva replied, her tone patient, instructional. You failed to interpret the three-dimensional reality. The environment is communicating that you are wrong. You need to learn to listen. The truth landed hard. The swagger drained from him, replaced by the chilling realization that his mistake had endangered every life in the unit. Ego had overridden competence and the cost could have been fatal. With Callan's authority broken, leadership evaporated. Lieutenant Miller looked overwhelmed, eyes wide in the whiteout. The others clustered together, movements tentative, confidence eroded by cold and consequence. Their gaze shifted from Miller to Eva. The transfer of command was silent and inevitable. Eva assumed control with the same calm efficiency she applied to malfunctioning systems. Her voice over the radio became a steady anchor amid fear and confusion. Listen carefully, she said, leaving no space for dissent. We're turning back. We will retrace to the last confirmed waypoint and establish a sheltered position to wait out the storm. Movement will be slow and deliberate. Check the person in front of you for frostbite. Sound off, starting from the rear. One by one. The soldiers checked in one by one, their voices tight but disciplined. Rurik was last. Rear clear, Captain. I have point, Eva announced. She removed Kalen from the lead without ceremony or malice, placing him in the center of the formation where his actions could be monitored. Specialist Kalen, you'll stay behind Specialist Diaz. Your only responsibility is to watch his back. Do you understand? Yes, Captain, Kalen replied quietly. The edge was gone from his voice, stripped away by the impersonal authority of the mountain itself. Eva turned forward and began moving not quickly, but with a deep, almost instinctive awareness of the terrain. A trekking pole extended from her grip, probing the snowpack ahead, testing stability with each step. She navigated by more than sight alone. She felt the density of the snow beneath her boots, the subtle shifts in wind pressure against her face, the faint echoes of its howl rebounding off unseen stone. She was fluent in the language of the environment, a language the others had never learned to hear. She guided them away from the deadly canyon, angling diagonally up a punishing slope. The route was exhausting and counterintuitive, demanding greater effort. But she knew it was the only path toward the comparative safety of the main ridge. She set a steady, relentless, rhythm-measured, unyielding. The unit followed, their confidence in her deepening with every sure-footed step. In a world reduced to chaos, she was their only fixed point. 2 hours later, she found what she'd been searching for, deep fissure in a rock face, nearly invisible through the swirling snow. It wasn't a cave, but it broke the wind. In here, she ordered. We make camp. The soldiers collapsed into the narrow shelter, bodies screaming with fatigue. Eva didn't pause. She immediately took control, her voice sharp and focused. Diaz, Peter's thermal blankets. Rurik Callan builds a snow wall at the entrance. It'll cut wind chill by 10 degrees. Miller, inventory, water, and rations. Now. They moved, sluggish at first, then faster, energized by her certainty. She seemed to be everywhere checking numbing fingers for frostbite, adjusting the angle of the snow wall, ensuring high-energy rations were distributed evenly. She was more than a commander. She was their medic, their instructor, their anchor, as they huddled together. Sharing warmth in the confined space, a fragile sense of safety returned. They watched her silhouette at the entrance, framed against the raging storm, her attention fixed outward. And in that moment, understanding settled in. Strength wasn't volume or muscle. It wasn't bravado or dominance. It was this quiet, relentless competence. The calm at the heart of violence. The ambush came without warning. The storm had eased. The whiteout thinning into a dense, disorienting fog. Sound was swallowed by snow. The world existed in muted gray. Eva had the unit moving again, pushing toward the relay station. They were traversing a narrow ledge carved into a steep drop, barely wide enough for single-file movement. The silence was the first alarm. Her instincts caught the absence of sound. The wind had faded, but so had everything else. No birds, no distant movement. The world was holding its breath. She raised one gloved hand. The column stopped instantly. Then the quiet shattered. A single crack from a high-velocity rifle tore through the fog. Specialist Diaz, directly behind Eva, cried out and went down. A dark bloom spreading across the white of his parka near the shoulder. The shot came from above, from rocks hidden in the mist. Chaos ignited. Rurik opened fire blindly into the fog, rounds whining as they struck unseen stone. Two of the younger soldiers flattened themselves against the cliff, frozen by fear. Kalen dropped to one knee, scanning desperately, unable to isolate a target in the gray void. Eva responded without panic. Training took over. In the fraction of a second after the shot, she processed the situation's single shooter. Elevated position, concealment via fog. Rurik, cease fire. She shouted, her commands snapping through his panic. You're exposing our position. Everyone, find cover. As the others scrambled, she moved toward Diaz. She unslung her rifle in one smooth motion and fired controlled bursts at the most probable firing point. Jagged rock cluster 100 meters upslope. The fire wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to buy time. Seconds were enough. She reached Diaz, already tearing open his medical kit. Report, she ordered, eyes on the wound. It hurts. I can't feel my arm, he gasped, shock draining color from his face. The round had passed cleanly through muscle. Severe, but survivable if controlled. You'll be fine, she said steadily. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze and applied a pressure dressing. Movements swift and exact. Her rifle resting within reach. Ready, Miller, she said, into her comms. Get the sat phone up. Declare hostile contact. Request immediate medevac to these coordinates. Inform them we're under fire and pinned. Another shot cracked. Stone fragments sprang inches from her head. She didn't flinch. She finished securing the bandage. Kalen, she said, eyes locked on the rocks above. The shooter is alone. He's pinning us until support arrives. He's counting on our predictable response. We're going to change the pattern. Kalen looked at her, fear and awe colliding. I'm going to draw his fire, she continued. When he shoots, you'll have 3 seconds to mark his position. Use your laser rangefinder. Do not miss. Before he could argue, she moved. She broke cover, sprinting 10 meters along the ledge to a different outcrop. Motion-controlled, deliberate. The sniper took the bait. A third shot cracked, snow and ice erupting where she had been moments before. Now, Kalen. Kalen raised his rifle, hands steady. The red laser pierced the fog. Got him, he shouted. 115 meters. Elevation 30 degrees. Eva needed nothing else. The engagement became mathematics. The variables were set. She settled into a firing position, sight already aligned. She wasn't aiming at a man, she was solving a trajectory. Her breathing slowed. She exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The single shot was almost anticlimactic. For a brief stretch of time, there was nothing, only the muffled hush of the fog and the distant echo of wind. Then a dark figure toppled from the rocks above, tumbling end over end before vanishing into the gray void below. The threat was neutralized. The engagement was finished. Eva was already moving, returning to Diaz without hesitation. The debriefing room could not have been more different from the chaos of the mountain ledge. It was quiet, brightly illuminated, and meticulously ordered. Colonel Vance and Sergeant Major Thorne sat at one end of a long, polished table. Opposite them were the surviving members of the detachment, faces freshly cleaned. Uniforms restored, but their eyes still carried the hollow imprint of combat. Helmet camera. Footage played on a large wall-mounted screen. A silent, first-person record of what had occurred. The video showed the whiteout conditions, Rurick's panicked, uncontrolled firing, Kalen's moment of hesitation. Then it showed Eva. Footage from Lieutenant Miller's camera was steady, capturing her movements with stark clarity, her calm commands. Disciplined, suppressive fire, methodical treatment of Diaz's wound. And finally, her deliberate sprint into exposure to draw the sniper's attention. The room remained silent as the footage ended on the single, precise shot she had fired. Colonel Vance folded his hands together, his expression unreadable. He looked across the table at the soldiers. "This mission began with a failure of discipline," he said, his voice cold and controlled. His eyes locked onto Kalen and Rurick. "It began with unprofessional conduct, followed by a catastrophic failure in navigation driven by ego, and culminated in a complete breakdown of fire discipline under contact." Each word settled heavily in the air. "Specialist, Kalen, your arrogance nearly led this unit into a fatal terrain trap. Specialist Rurick, your panic under fire endangered your team and wasted critical ammunition. Both of you disregarded the authority of your commanding officer and demonstrated a profound lack of judgment." Kalen and Rurick stared down at the tabletop, faces drained of color. There was no defense to offer. The evidence was incontrovertible, captured from multiple perspectives. The only reason this mission is being classified as a success instead of a casualty report, Vance continued, shifting his gaze to Eva seated at the far end of the table, posture perfectly composed, is because Captain Rastova compensated for your failures. She navigated you out of a storm you created. She assumed command when your leadership structure collapsed. She neutralized an enemy threat while the rest of you were either panicking or hiding. He leaned forward slightly. You are combat specialists. Your purpose is to perform under pressure. You failed. Captain Rastova is a technical intelligence officer. She succeeded. I suggest you reflect on that. The repercussions were swift and clinical. Kalen and Rurick received official reprimands. Their specialist qualifications were revoked, and they were reassigned to a logistics unit at another installation. Their future in special operations ended that day. Lieutenant Miller received a formal letter of counsel for failure to maintain command authority. They were dismissed as the chastened soldiers filed out. Sergeant Major Thorne met Eva's eyes. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod and unspoken gesture of deep respect. One professional acknowledging another. Later that day, in the base armory, Eva conducted post-mission maintenance on her rifle. One of the younger soldiers approached hesitantly. It was Peters, the one who had frozen against the cliff wall. He lingered for a moment, shifting his weight, clearly intimidated. "Captain," he said at last. Eva continued her work, drawing a solvent-soaked patch through the barrel. "Specialist," she replied. I wanted to say thank you," he stammered. "What you did out there, we wouldn't have made it back without you." Eva paused and looked up. Her expression wasn't warm, but it wasn't dismissive either. "You did your job, Peters. You held your position. You followed orders. That's all that was required. Yes, but I was scared." She pushed the cleaning rod through the barrel one final time, then met his eyes. "Fear is just a variable. You acknowledge it. You factor it into your calculations. Then you execute the mission. Being a soldier isn't about not being afraid. It's about functioning despite it. Peters nodded slowly, absorbing the lesson, one far more valuable than anything he'd been taught in training. "Thank you, Captain," he said again, the words now carrying genuine, hard-earned respect. He left her to her work. Across the base, perception was shifting slowly. Irreversibly, Miva returned to the quiet isolation of her workshop, the same space where it had all begun. Outside, the Arctic wind howled a familiar, almost reassuring sound. The high-frequency transceiver she had repaired sat secured in its rack, status light glowing a steady, healthy green. The mission was complete. Report submitted. Consequences delivered. The base's steady routine reasserted itself. On the workbench before her lay her rifle, fully disassembled. Each pin, spring, and lever rested in precise alignment on a clean, oil-resistant mat. Weapon maintenance was ritual meditative, grounding, a method of restoring order after violence. Her hands moved with unconscious precision, every motion refined through thousands of repetitions. She scrubbed carbon fouling from the bolt carrier group. Her concentration absolute. Thoughts of Callan and Rurik surfaced not with satisfaction, but with quiet regret. Their failure was wasteful. Training squandered. Potential lost. Arrogance had been a structural flaw, one that cascaded under pressure into total system collapse. They believed strength was something declared loudly, defended through dominance and aggression. They never learned that true strength was silent. It was the discipline to execute a tedious task flawlessly 1,000 times. The patience to listen to the environment rather than impose will upon it. The control to remain steady while others surrendered to panic. She reassembled the trigger mechanism, the small components locking together with soft, precise clicks. Her thoughts turned to Peters and his confession of fear. Fear was a variable, but discipline was the algorithm that processed it. Without discipline, fear devolved into panic. With discipline, it became focus. It sharpened perception, stripped distractions, forced clarity. That was her edge. Not fearlessness, but mastery, forged through a lifetime of relentless self-command. She finished assembling the rifle and worked the charging handle. The bolt slid home with crisp mechanical finality. She engaged the safety and returned the weapon to its rack. Her task was complete. The system was balanced. The variables were, for now, stable. She looked down at her hands. Steady, clean. Instruments capable of repairing a fragile circuit or ending a life with equal precision. The burden of that duality rested entirely on her shoulders. She carried it not lightly, but knowingly. The quiet hum of electronics filled the workshop. Strength was not a privilege. It was a responsibility.